The businessman's lifeless body lay twisted in his study, frozen in an expression of agony, his mouth locked in a silent scream. The golden glow of the chandelier flickered overhead, casting jagged shadows that stretched unnaturally along the walls. His once pristine silk robe was ruined, marred by claw-like burns, blackened and curling like fingers branded into his flesh. Beyond the glass windows, the city pulsed with life, neon signs flickering, cars threading through the streets, oblivious to the horror sealed within these walls. But here, in this room, the air was thick, heavy, almost sentient. A suffocating stillness clung to the space, pressing against the skin, seeping into the walls. Something had been here, and something had watched him die. Shadows of vengeance. The security guard wiped his brow, his fingers trembling as he rewound the footage, again. His gut told him to stop watching, but he couldn't. There, right there. Just before the moment of death, he saw it, a shifting blackness, unnatural in the way it moved, coiling across the ceiling like a living creature. It wasn't a shadow. It wasn't a trick of the light. It was something else. Something that shouldn't be there. A bead of sweat slid down the back of his neck. The silence in the room stretched too long, thick and oppressive, pressing into his skin like an unseen hand. He swallowed hard. The air around him felt aware. Waiting. Watching, still, his eyes remained locked on the screen. He should look away. He should run. But he didn't. He couldn't. Manat stood over the body, jaw clenched tight, stomach coiled with something he refused to name. He had seen death in all its forms, bloody, desperate, quiet. But this? This was different. The victim's face was locked in sheer terror, his mouth stretched open as if his final breath had never entirely escaped. His limbs bent wrong, unnatural angles that made Manat's muscles ache just looking at them. A low hum of electricity filled the air, the lone desk lamp flickering, casting jagged shadows that stretched and trembled along the walls. He exhaled, steadying himself. His eyes flicked to the glass cabinet in the corner, catching his reflection, dark, warped. But behind him, just for a moment, the reflection seemed wrong, not quite him, not quite human. Pimjai exhaled slowly, steadying herself as her fingers traced the brittle newspaper clippings. Decades of dust clung to the pages, rising in the dim light and filling the air with the scent of paper and time. The words blurred beneath her gaze, their meaning sinking in like a slow, suffocating weight against her ribs. Then, a sound. A quiet shuffle behind her. She froze. A draft? A rat? The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Her pulse quickened. The old filing cabinet stood slightly open, though she had not touched it. Her fingers curled against the paper, heart pounding in her throat. Something else was here. Mud clung to the journal's brittle pages, its ink bled into veins of decay, and the words half swallowed by time. A lantern flickered nearby, its flame sputtering, barely holding against the wind that howled through the abandoned camp. Then, the hand. The skeletal, decayed hand. It lay half buried in the dirt, its bony fingers locked around a rusted compass. The needle twitched, erratic, restless, as if still trying to find its way home. No footprints in the mud. No signs of struggle. They had come searching, and they had not left. The village was silent, too silent, a silence that felt unnatural, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. Mist curled around the wooden houses, creeping through doorways, swallowing them in an eerie embrace. Lanterns flickered weakly behind shuttered windows, their glow barely piercing the thick fog. But no one stepped outside. A whisper of wind drifted through the empty streets, carrying the scent of damp earth and something else, something old, something forgotten. Then, movement. Beyond the twisted branches of the ancient banyan tree, two figures stood, unmoving, watching, waiting. Steam curled lazily from Pimjai's cup, drifting between them like its own presence. The tea sat untouched, the scent of jasmine faint, distant, forgotten. She stared past it, eyes unfocused, her thoughts caught between what was said and what wasn't. The dim lantern light cast warm, golden hues across their table, a deceptive contrast to the cold, heavy feeling in her gut. Across from her, Manat leaned back in his chair, his fingers tracing slow, deliberate circles against the glass he held. His expression was unreadable, and his silence was louder than words. Their conversation was careful and measured. Every pause felt deliberate, and every breath carried the weight of meaning left unsaid. Outside, the neon lights flickered against the rain-slick streets. A shadow passed across the window, or maybe it didn't. Neither of them acknowledged it, neither of them dared to. The ink had smudged, dark stains blooming across Somchai's fingertips as he dragged them over the paper. The sketch was crude, hurried, almost frantic, but the details were unmistakable. The mansion loomed at the center of the page, its windows nothing but gaping voids. From its edges, shadows twisted and stretched, creeping downward, toward the figures drawn at the bottom. They had no faces, only open mouths stretched wide in silent, endless screams. Somchai tilted his head, eyes flicking to the room's corners, as if listening. It was like something beyond the edge of hearing was whispering, breathing, and waiting. No one else heard it, but he did. Candia held the photograph gently, her fingers brushing the faded edges, tracing the years worn into its surface. Her parents stood frozen in time, captured in front of the grand estate, a home that no longer existed. What remained now was only a ruin, swallowed by decay and silence. The corners of the photograph were burned, the image warped by heat and time, the faces still clear but distant, unreachable. Her lips parted, but no words came, only the flickering candlelight moved, twin flames dancing in her dark eyes, reflecting something deep, something unspeakable, something that should have stayed buried. The fire crackled, spitting embers into the cold night air, but its warmth did not reach the gathered villagers. Shadows stretched long across the ground, flickering like restless spirits. Wrinkled hands clutched old charms, fingers moving in silent, desperate prayers. No one looked at Manat and Pimjai directly. Their gazes drifted past them, through them, as if seeing too clearly would invite something unspeakable. A debt long unpaid. A curse long whispered. Some sins do not fade with time, some sins refuse to be forgotten. The vines coiled tightly around the wooden sign, their tendrils woven through the cracks as if nature was trying to bury the past. The lettering was faded, barely legible beneath years of decay. Sri Suan Estate, no entry. The wind stirred the trees, carrying with it the faint, hollow chime of a music box, its notes warped by distance. Too soft to be real. It is clear and easy to imagine, Manat exhaled slowly. The weight in his chest was heavier than fear. He pressed forward. Some ghosts would not be ignored, some refused to stay dead. Manat stepped through the overgrown path, his breath shallow as he caught his first glimpse of the mansion. Sri Suan Estate, its once proud facade was now a monument to ruin. Once smooth and regal, the grand stone walls were fractured, streaked with the grime of years long forgotten. Ivy choked the structure, twisting over the stone like grasping fingers, reclaiming what time had left behind. The windows gaped, hollow voids where glass once gleamed and light poured through. Now, only darkness remained. The air was thick, unmoving as if the house was holding its breath. Beyond the tangled trees, the sun dipped lower, casting its final glow. The light touched the mansion's battered walls for a moment, and in that brief sliver of time, the shadows shifted, not with the wind, not with the light, they moved. Manat stepped into the basement, the air damp and heavy. His flashlight swept across the walls, then stopped. Small, child-sized handprints pressed deep into the stone. They were old and stained. His breath caught as he moved closer, the silence pressing in. A rusted music box lay open in the center of the floor. His light flickered over its tarnished metal teeth, then, a single note, thin, trembling, breaking the silence like a whisper in the dark. Then, nothing. The air felt wrong. Something had never left. The past unfolded, not in words, but in the frozen stillness of the photograph. The soldiers sat at the long dinner table, their hungry eyes dark with something other than food. Their hands rested near untouched plates, tension thick in their rigid postures. Behind them, the Sri Suan family stood. Their forms were barely illuminated, their expressions unreadable. And yet, The shadows behind them stretched to far.as if warning.as if screaming. The past unfolded, not in words but in the frozen stillness of the photograph. The soldiers sat at a long dinner table, their hungry eyes dark with a yearning that had nothing to do with food. Their hands rested near untouched plates, and tension hung thick in their rigid postures. Behind them, the Shrisuan family stood. Their forms were barely illuminated, and their expressions were unreadable. And yet, the shadows behind them stretched too far. As if warning. As if screaming. The first note of the lullaby shivered through the air, the candle flame sputtered. The walls exhaled a deep, hollow breath. At the edges of the room, the shadows curled. Shifted. Rose, clawed fingers dragged along the floor, reaching. Kandie's voice was barely above a whisper, yet the words carried weight, old, powerful, untouched by time. The candlelight quivered, its glow shrinking as if afraid. Around her, the shadows rippled, bending, twisting, their shapes stretching in ways that defied reason. The air thickened, pressing against her skin. A silence settled, not empty, but expectant. The darkness was listening. The figure loomed, its form shifting, one moment human, the next, something monstrous. Its edges blurred, unraveling and reforming as if it had never truly settled on one shape. The air grew thick, heavy with judgment, with something older than words. Somchai and Kandie did not flinch. Did not cower. They had called it, and it had come. The mayor's breath came fast, uneven, his chest rising in sharp, shallow bursts. His fingers clenched around the gun, knuckles white, the cold metal slick with sweat. The room felt too small. The walls pressed in, the air thick, suffocating. Outside, the city pulsed with life, oblivious. Unaware, but inside, the shadows moved, and they were watching. One by one, the streetlights flickered, then died. Kandie walked unhurriedly, her robes whispering against the pavement. Behind her, the city vanished into the void, swallowed whole by a darkness deeper than night. The air pulsed, heavy, electric, alive. The final hunt had begun. The mayor's screams ripped through the estate, raw and fractured, his voice breaking as the shadow enveloped him. It was no longer one entity, but many, writhing, whispering, consuming. A chorus of unseen voices tangled in the darkness, folding over him like a tide that would never recede. The air crackled with his confession, his final words trapped in the still recording security camera, and then, silence. Kandie knelt before the shrine, the incense smoke curling, twisting, disappearing into the still air. Her lips moved in silent prayer, but the words were not meant for the living. Behind her, a shift. Subtle. Weightless, not vengeful. Not restless, just watching. As dawn broke, golden light spilled over the rooftops, but it did nothing to chase away the weight pressing against Manat and Pimjai. Below, the city stirred, oblivious, its streets alive with movement, untouched by the horrors buried beneath. Pimjai hugged her knees to her chest, her gaze distant, unfocused. Beside her, Manat exhaled slowly, the smoke from his cigarette curling into the morning air, dissolving like a fading memory. Neither spoke. There were no words left, but somewhere, carried by the breeze, a lullaby still played.